Hello and welcome back to Book and Page. We are starting All Quiet on the Western Front today. This is an interesting one for me to do. One, because, to be upfront, this is the first text that I am doing on this show that I have not studied in university, directly with a professor helping to point some of these things out. So it's a bit of a new territory for me on that one. Though I will say with a lot of my videos, some of those things are pulled from class, a lot of other ones is just me having reread the thing going, oh, that's cool, I wish we had gotten a chance to discuss that. So I'm not completely out of my comfort zone here, because I also read this during high school originally, and so rereading it, this is about the third time I've reread it, I'm picking up things that prior to this point I didn't necessarily do. The other thing to keep in mind is this is a war novel, and it's actually from a German perspective. So that's going to affect how we read it, but I think we want to be careful not to let it affect us significantly. We should, at this point in time, with this much distance, be able to recognize that large groups of people are not purely the enemy for being part of that group. And it's really interesting because it actually starts with this little section here which fully admits to that. It says, "This is neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all an adventure, for death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will try simply to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped shells, were destroyed by the war." And that's precisely what this book is trying to do. It's not meant to be a fun romp that we can just, oh yay, adventure, fun times. But it's also not trying to say any one group was fully in the right or fully in the wrong. There are a lot of complicated issues, especially around world wars. So being able to take a step back and recognize this as an awful situation for everyone who is involved becomes really important. And that's why I think reading something like All Quiet on the Western Front today is still very important, simply because it helps you understand something that most of us probably have never experienced, at least here in the Western world. And it lets you then at least try to start understanding this. You'll never fully understand something until you've experienced it, but stories are specifically to try and help you bridge the gap between these different lives and these different people who have different experiences than you, and try to help each other understand those different experiences. Like, I really honestly believe that is what stories are for. So, All Quiet on the Western Front is here to help us understand a generation of people that we are not, and that probably seem very alien to us in a lot of ways. So, as always, we'll start with a brief summary of what happened in Chapter 1, and then get on to discussing things in a little more detail. So this is a bit of a weird introduction. This is a first-person novel. Our narrator, Paul, we don't actually get a name for until a few pages in. So, Paul starts us out, surprisingly, 5 miles behind the front, where his company is having a very good day. They've all got full bellies, and it turns out they've got about twice as many rations as they normally get. This seems a bit odd, but then we find out this is due to a miscalculation, because 15 days prior to this, his company was sent to the front, and last night they returned, having suffered major casualties and lost about half of their company. So the cook, not realizing this, pulled the rations for the full second company and didn't take into account the fact that he only had about 80 men rather than 150. So, when he does realize this, we get a few things happening. One, we meet all of our major cast of characters. We have Paul standing in line with two of his childhood friends, Kropp and Muller, who were part of the same school class as him and actually enlisted together, as well as a collection of other people, including Kat, who's sort of the leader of their group and one of the oldest at 40. Most of everybody else is 19, which gives you a sense of how young these characters actually are. Well, they're all waiting for food, but the cook won't feed them because he is waiting for the full company. When he's made aware of his error, he actually still refuses to feed them because he doesn't think he can hand out all of the rations that he's pulled to half the company. Thankfully, the lieutenant does come along, finds out what the problem is, and tells the cook to go ahead and hand everything out. So, they're having a pretty good day today. Their bellies are full, they've got extra cigars and cigarettes, and Crop, Muller, and Paul head off to the latrine field to play some cards. Seems a bit odd to us, but Paul is quick to tell us that bodily functions for soldiers are no longer embarrassing, they're quite natural, and they just deal with it. The latrine buckets actually have pretty good seats, they're lovely places to play cards, and most of their humor revolves around bodily functions, which he does admit is going to be weird when he heads back from war and has to adjust to proper civilian life again. While they're playing cards, they decide that they're going to go visit a wounded comrade of theirs, and on the way they actually reminisce about the schoolmaster who encouraged them all as a class to enlist for the war, including one fellow who didn't want to, but it was eventually goaded into it, and was in fact one of the first that they saw die, having taken a bullet to the eye, and then, in blindly attempting to get back, was shot down. Yeah, it's one of these novels. It is not shying away from the gore aspect of all of this. In fact, when they head out to visit Remarque, who's their wounded friend, they find out that one of his feet have been amputated and he is dying. He's not likely to make it through the night, though no one's actually told him that. He's quite convinced that he's going to go home. He's not even aware he's missing a foot. Surprisingly, Muller's a little more focused on trying to get Remarque's boots, and Crump has a bit of an issue with the injustice of everything. So the end of the chapter actually finishes with them trying to walk off the red that Crump is seeing, and Paul having to admit that this is a perfectly normal thing for them. It happens quite often. And that's chapter 1 of like 12. It's gonna be a ride. But that's why that first blurb is there. That first blurb is actually there for anyone who picks this up and thinks, oh, I'm just gonna have a fun little war romp. This is precisely not the heroic image of war, and sort of that image we have now with video games where we'll pick a group of people, maybe it's aliens, and big beefy guys with guns and no emotions because they're super manly. It's not one of those romps. And Eric is like very sure to highlight that as we're going through from the first chapter. But I should mention, like I said before, this chapter starts in a really odd place. We're 5 miles behind the lines, and Paul actually tells us they're having a perfectly good day. And that's not what we're expecting when we get this first little blurb saying, like, facing down death isn't an adventure. Like, it's terrifying. And then we start with, oh yeah, no, our bellies are full and we're at peace. So it almost sort of tricks us right at the beginning, only to cut that out, like, right away. So we get this idea of, oh, this can't be all bad, right? These people are relaxing, they're being fed well, the cook's more worried about having pans for coffee than he is about anything else. And then we get, like, point blank, this explanation that we were sent to the front and half of our company is dead or wounded. Like, Paul does not mince words here. he is very direct in saying all of this isn't because the company is super generous. It is because most of them are dead. And the survivors are taking advantage of this mistake. But that doesn't always hit us right away. It's this really weird thing when, again, if you haven't experienced something like this, you could slip right over that section very easily because Paul says it so nonchalantly. Like, it's a fact of life. That's where we are right now. But then what happens is Remarque is very good at taking us a step back to when the cook first realized this. Because the cook looks like a very jolly fellow where he's waving everybody back to get more food because he wants to make coffee. But we're then stepped back to earlier that morning when all of these people are waiting in line to get fed, and the cook has to face the realization that half the company is gone. And that becomes, like, that should be making us more aware of what's actually happening here, especially because Paul then starts personalizing, and this is going to sound weird when we recognize these people are humans, but he is humanizing this company. Because prior to this point where we have them all waiting for food, it's just a conglomerate of people that we know nothing about other than their stomachs are full and they've got some extra cigarettes. So when we're starting to get at this idea that they've been through a really horrific thing is when we actually then start getting names and faces and personalities attached to these people. So he puts them all in the soup line, which one gives you a really good way of doing this, where we're going down the line, meeting some of these characters. But we're also getting to know them a little more. Like, we found out that Muller keeps his school books with him, and he tends to mumble to himself about mathematics when under fire. Like, that's a really weird thing. But then you realize that that's precisely it. Having a weird fact like that suddenly makes you feel like you know this person far more personally than if you just found out he had brown hair. Like, plenty of people have brown hair. You see people with brown hair all the time. But to know that somebody under pressure tends to mutter about mathematics suddenly makes you feel like this is a very unique person. It's not a cardboard cutout that you can then just ignore. And so suddenly this line of people becomes honestly a line of people. They're much more humanized and personalized in this moment, even when the descriptions are very short. We don't get full pages and pages and pages about these people. They're very quick, short little things, but it's enough for us to suddenly understand we're not looking at, like, a collection of putty people that we're gonna mow down at some point. We are looking at actual, honest-to-God people, a lot of them who are really young, and we have the same sort of reaction that the cook does. We've got this impatience to start because we've started in a weird place. We're here to read a war novel, right? We want to get into the shooting and the fighting and the action and manly men. Blah! Well, that's not what All Quiet on the Western Front is trying to give us. It is precisely trying to give us a real, honest-to-God image of the devastation of war. And it does that by starting with the people who are here. But we are starting in media res. We are starting in the middle of a story. We don't start with Paul and his friends signing up. They have already been to the front, and their company has already been devastated. So when we meet these characters, they're already... beyond keeping innocent. These aren't characters that we want to hold close so the world doesn't hurt them. The world has already hurt them very badly, and we are forced to recognize that in a lot of ways. Mueller doesn't just mumble about mathematics when he's stressed. He mumbles about them when they're being shelled. When people are actively trying to kill him, and he is actively trying to kill them in return. This moment where we're actually standing in the line for beans is the real moment that we get thrust in there. And you're suddenly walking among these men with the realization, this is not going to end well. And then we get pulled back a little bit. We're not going to go for complete and utter devastation immediately. Because truth be told, and Remarque is really good at giving this to us in here, is it's not all one way or all the other. There are going to be lighthearted moments for these soldiers, simply because they have to find those lighthearted moments and hold on to them, or they will be completely and utterly devastated. So after we have the soup kitchen thing, we actually meet them then in the latrine field. And that's such a weird place for us to put them, but Paul does point out that this is kind of normal for them. Soldiers are always being watched, so getting over the embarrassing things that you want to hide from people is needed. You can't be embarrassed about going to the washroom when all your fellow soldiers and your commanding officers are watching you do it. So it becomes one of those things that you either have to get angry about or you have to laugh about. You can get angry about the breach of privacy, or you can laugh about, hey, wasn't it funny we ever found this embarrassing? And that second option, again, helps you find that lightheartedness and connect with those around you. You're not shutting yourself off. You're precisely opening up because you have to. And you open up in a way that is probably the easiest to, which is to talk about bodily functions. Because the other thing to keep in mind is Paul specifies that most of the relationship between the soldiers are based on the bowels in the intestines. And this refers to some innocent things like eating together and going to the washroom together. But you also have to recognize this again refers to the really graphic and macabre things. This is in reference to bodies being torn apart on the field. It's in reference to watching people die. And it is also in reference to the fact that as you do die, you're not always in control of your faculties. A lot of war novels, older historic war novels and more modern time war novels, will often tell you you do not have control of your bowels in moments like this. So I'm not going to be able to avoid this word for most of this video series, so I'm just going to say it. Shitting yourself is actually a normal thing in wartime situations. So the acceptance of that has to be there somewhere. But right away for us, you've been brought in and you've started recognizing these people as people, but you're also suddenly aware of this gulf between you where for many of us in Western societies and other societies and cultures, that is a very private thing. But at war, it precisely can't be. Because you need to trust that your friends are going to be there as you're dying, even when you lose control of your bowels. Like, that can't be a thing that anybody shies away from anymore. precisely because community still has to exist even if they don't have control of anything, even their own bodies. And that's a really uncomfortable feeling that, like, Paul is pointing towards. He knows full well that this makes a gap between him and the society he came from and the societies he's hoping to return to. So reading about it, it is sort of this reminder that we haven't been in that position. Because I'm sure for people who have been in that position, that's a much more normal thing. And they're growing closer here. This is actually a book that is meant for a couple different audiences. I find it really helps for those who were never soldiers, but it is also a connecting point, I think, for people who have experienced these things, again, to recognize themselves in other people. Books are precisely that moment where somebody reaches through time and space and takes hold of your hand. And I think that's different for all of us with different experiences, right? But we are sort of placed in this moment where we think we can understand these people, and then there's a turn that does highlight whether or not you've ever been here. And this turn is then followed by another one. This is actually like really rapid fire for highlighting where you are in relationship to these characters. Because we have this conversation about them playing cards in the latrine field and how bodily functions are completely normal. They have to be. And then they're discussing, oh, let's go visit our friend in the hospital. And you think, okay, that's where we're going to go next. And we get this then flashback to these people as students with a schoolmaster and a teacher pushing them to enlist. And not just the teacher. The teacher is sort of the spark for Paul remembering all this stuff. But he fully admits that a lot of other people in the community were just as willing to get on board with what the teacher was saying. He actually says even your parents are willing to use the word coward in reference to you because they don't know what's going to happen. This should be noted, this is First World War. So this is the war to end all wars. It is precisely the war that no one thought was going to be nearly as devastating as it was. A lot of these people thought they were going to be home by the first Christmas. And that's precisely not what they got. So Paul has this memory moment of the schoolmaster and other members of the community, particularly older members of the community, who were pushing these young men into enlisting, even against their will, and goading them into it. Oh, you'd be cowardly if you didn't. You're abandoning your country. You're not a real patriot. And what's interesting is Paul himself is struggling with this because he's now aware of what a war entails. He's watched people die. He's killed people. He's aware of the truth of the matter and the story that these people were telling and how those are not compatible. He says that among the guns and the shells and the blood, their world fell apart. And the world he refers to is the world of the teachers and the parents who so patriotically believed that you had to go and do your duty and, like, protect the motherland, as it were. And again, this is something that can actually be applied to all countries who were part of this war. It is not just a German idea that you need to protect the motherland or the fatherland or your country or your people. That is precisely the notable propaganda argument that practically every country involved in both world wars used. That other group of people is threatening our group of people. They're trying to change who we are. We need to protect our people. And that's a story you can easily believe until it gets down to the nitty-gritty, which is the blood and the death and the dying. and the explosions and the barbed wire and the trenches and the trench foot and the lack of rations and all of this. And suddenly that story about how you're in the right and everybody else is in the wrong and the young people have to go and prove it just falls to pieces. And like I said before, this is another turn where we have the latrine as sort of this turn away from, or into, if you're a soldier, these characters and identifying where you are in comparison to them. This conversation about patriotism and how quickly you're willing to throw everybody else onto the front and not necessarily yourself. Like, that's what's being highlighted here with the teacher. He is not here. He brought all his classes to enlist. He is not here. And there's an issue with that. Because if you honestly believe that you need to defend your country, why aren't you here? Why is it that you need to defend your country, but other people need to do it? And it really does set up this idea that if you're a really patriotic person who's reading this, that's going to be another turn where you're suddenly going to have to try and either keep your position or adjust as sort of the world spins around you. Because that idea of patriotism without thinking through the logistics and the actual harm being caused is, I think, in the text, from the text, is idiotic. It's extremely naive, and the moment you're like confronted with any of these terrifying things and devastating things, it should start to fall apart. And so it's just turn after turn after turn, and every moment that you think you get your footing underneath you, is being pulled back. We nearly finish up the chapter with the visiting of Remarque and his wound. And this gives you a real, again, concrete sense of the devastation happening. Before we found out that they had lost to death or injury over half of their company, and now you're actually physically seeing one of these people who's lost his foot, who's dying. Paul is describing how waxy and pale he is, the dirt under his fingernails, what actually happens to the body even after the body dies. He's imagining the fingernails that keep growing, and it's sort of this thought spiral he gets into that he gets pulled back out from. So we meet the people and we humanize the people, but we also humanize those who are going to die shortly. We don't just act like that half of the company that actually died before the novel began aren't important. No, we're seeing them right here, right in front of us, and how horrifying that is. Especially for then the soldiers visiting him that have to understand in some concept that this is a strong possibility for them. And what's interesting is we're seeing all three of these people deal with it in different ways that we have to recognize are legitimate in different ways. That doesn't mean they're comfortable reactions. I think perhaps Muller makes us the most uncomfortable because he's very interested in Kemmerich's boots and is actually fixated on the boots. But this is something that people were thinking about. They're also trying to take care of themselves even when you can't necessarily then take care of other people. Kemmerich is past the point of saving, and even if they don't tell him he's missing a foot, they're aware of it. He's not going to be able to use at least one of those boots, even if he miraculously pulls through. So we're actually seeing different philosophies here meeting in this last section, because Muller is facing the idea of taking care of those that you can save, even if it's at the price of those you can't. Well, Kropp is interesting because he's starting to really struggle with the injustice of all of this. Paul describes it as him seeing red, in the last little bit where he actually like throws down his cigarette and stomps on it in anger. But you see it a little before that when he asks the doctor to give Remarque some morphine because he's suffering. And the doctor wants to refuse. He doesn't want to give a lowly soldier who's not going to make it any medicine that they could use for somebody else. But Crump isn't seeing it that way. His accusation is that you have to have an officer's rank to get taken care of properly. He's seeing not only a society that's thrown young men into this mess, but simply doesn't care about them enough to fight for them and their survival. He sees a very deep injustice where the officers with important ranks are taken care of, but the foot soldiers are effectively just cannon fodder. And that's a problem he has to face. And then Paul is sort of trying to navigate all of these things while struggling with, I think, an existential crisis in a lot of ways, where he's trying to deal with how life it can be so much suffering and then end in death. And it really is this thought spiral as he's seeing Remarque's nails and picturing them growing up and around and around and around even after he's dead. Like, he is having this weird moment in the hospital of disassociation and how meaningless life is, especially when you suffer through it. So we see these people and we try to humanize them, but there's a gulf between us if you're not a soldier and you haven't experienced particularly trench warfare and the horrors that come with it. And then we also realize that none of these people are reacting the exact same way to each other. They're individuals, even if they're suffering through the same things, and their different versions of philosophy and how they're trying to deal with it differentiate them. So, right from the beginning to end, Eric is like making sure you understand that these are individual people. So when all of this goes wrong, and it is going to go wrong, it's a war novel, you can't turn away from it. You can't try and act like none of these people were people. They had friends and family, and they struggled with understanding life and suffering and death. And it should grab you at that point. I always get to the end of this chapter, and I just want to keep reading more, because these kids, and they really are kids, are just trying to figure out how to deal with the fact that they're in a horrible situation, and so many of them are going to die. And it's never going to be an easy way to understand that. So I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.